Morning. Thank you so much for joining us right here in the studios of ABS Television for another post-cabinet media briefing. Cabinet having met yesterday after a one-week hiatus. And here with us on a Thursday morning to give us details of some of the key decisions taken by the nation's executive body, the Minister for Information, Honorable Melford Nicholas, and the Chief of Staff in the Prime Minister's Office, Ambassador Lionel Hurst. Without any further ado, over to both gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Burford. We are delighted to be here. I know I can speak for Minister Nicholas. And the Cabinet is delighted to send us here. We know that very important decisions are taken, and no one is better equipped to summarize those decisions than the Honorable Melford Nicholas. Sir, over to you.
Good morning, Antigua Barbuda. Good morning to all the audiences and all of the media personalities here present. I cannot escape the poppy that is on the lapel of Mr. Burford. I think today marks another anniversary of Armistice Day, the 11th of November. So I should really go out and find my puppy as well. But it's a significant day in relation to world history. But yesterday's cabinet meeting would have focused on, of course, the inevitable developments surrounding COVID and our management of the pandemic. And of course, we had our two usual guests, in the person of the Chief Medical Officer and, of course, the Director of Education, given that there was a timeline drawn for some changes in respect of persons who are attending secondary schools, the public schools and private schools, who had to become vaccinated within a 15-day period after the shortage of Pfizer vaccines that we had led to us making an earlier decision to allow for a short period of time the blending of vaccinated and unvaccinated students, given the imperative of getting as many students face-to-face in a face-to-face learning environment. But the Cabinet did mandate, and that expiration of that sweet period, if you would, expired yesterday. And so as of this morning, and we would have released ahead of this Cabinet press briefing, a press statement yesterday to give parents and students an opportunity to avail themselves of the availability of these vaccines. The CMO would have indicated to us at Cabinet yesterday that the Ministry of Health had made the vaccines available at several of the schools, but that the take-up was marginal, to say the least. And so the government has maintained its position, and we are firm on that position that all eligible students must be vaccinated, not only on the basis of the public health advisory, but it is now a matter of law, because the Senate would have approved the amendment to the Education Act that we would have discussed and debated in Parliament earlier last month. And so that was one of the major outcomes of yesterday's deliberation on COVID. The other major issues that came out of our discussion on COVID yesterday had to do with the mandates in the private sector. We have not seen yet the type of uptick that we were expecting with respect to the number of persons coming forward to be vaccinated, given the mandate for the private sector. And of course, the mandates were done in a way at the time to give businesses the cover to make it a requirement for the employees to comply. Having looked at the weak response that we have had, we have strengthened now the mandates to include a penalty for businesses who continue to be outside of the observance of the mandate. And when the next public health advisory is published in the coming days, it will give clearly the timeline by which we would expect compliance, further compliance from the private sector, and of course, the penalties, which I can now indicate would be 5,000 EC dollars in each instance. The other point that I would wish to raise at this stage in respect of the COVID environment, the Chief Medical Officer did indicate that the numbers continue to tick downwards. I will share with the state media and the other members of the forum a graph that would indicate how far we have progressed in a positive direction since we had those extremely high numbers early on, a few weeks back. Not only have the numbers ticked down quite nicely, but we still have the benefit of having an adequate supply of vaccines. And of course, the Chief Medical Officer indicated that we are due to receive another 19,000 doses of the AstraZeneca vaccines in another 2 weeks. So we do have enough vaccines to be able to get us into that position. I would have also disclosed to the cabinet that we are at the full level of capacity that I wanted to be at in respect of the production of the ID cards. Excuse me. The teams that are both on the Friesel Road and at the Multipurpose Center are in a position to produce at minimum 1,000 cards per day. The tracking that I've seen, we approximately 160 persons who have not yet had their cards for those who have applied yesterday. So that number would easily be overtaken today, as well as any additional applications who may come in. So I'm satisfied that we are at capacity and we can, in fact, meet the demand. Of course, and I did indicate to the digitization manager who manages that card production system that we would expect a form of a deluge in the coming days, simply because the cabinet has now given consent for bars and clubs to be reopened as of Monday next week. We have taken a few days to allow all persons to be able to get their houses in order. And so as of next Monday, bars and clubs can be reopened, of course, under certain guidelines. We are copying in those guidelines that we would have put in place earlier, but we want to ensure that the Ministry of Health, through the Central Board of Health, is prepared to do whatever further evaluation they need to do between now and then as the bars and clubs open. We would expect them to be observing of all of the conditions in terms of sanitization and all of the requisite social distancing when that time takes place. But more importantly, we are restricting persons to attend these particular places of business. Only those persons who possess a photo ID vaccination card will be permitted. The standard paper vaccine cards will not be permitted as entry, simply because persons would have attempted to fraudulently produce these cards in the past at the last interval when we had the bars and the clubs open for entertainment. So that's some good news for persons who are patrons of these type of establishments, and we would expect, of course, them to observe all the protocols. So it is anticipated that there will be a further demand for these cards, and as I've indicated earlier, we are up to the level of capacity where we think we'll be able to manage the demand going forward. Turning our attention briefly now to some economic good news. Of course, members of the public would have observed that there had been the arrival, we had witnessed the arrival of several cruise ships. At least there were 2 in St. John's Harbor at a day last week. And of course, the schedule has been published. We would expect to see more of these crafts arriving. And of course, as I'd indicated on a previous press briefing, we have ended the bubble arrangement and we are now into free flow, where the patrons who come on the ships, by and large, vaccinated persons, will be able to ply the vendors and all those who have services on offer for the tourism trade. And it's a good bit of incentive for our taxi drivers and our vendors and our shop operators in the Heritage Quay and Redcliffe Quay area, and of course restaurants as well. We like that because the precipitate that we get from the tourists, the spend that we get from the tourists, actually helps the overall health and climate of the economy. More importantly, the Minister of Tourism would have given us an insight, a very exciting insight into the landside development that is going to take place over the next coming months with respect to global ports. At the appropriate time, I'm sure both the Minister of Tourism and the heads at Global Port will make that available to the media and to the public, and I'm sure when you have the opportunity to see it, each of you will be as delighted as the Cabinet was yesterday with the transformation that will take place in Lower St. John's and the impact that it is likely to have on our cruise industry, and more importantly, the impact that it will have on our young people who are leaving schools and who are still awaiting their first job. So the future looks good, and we anticipate that the first half of next year is going to be an exciting time for not only the infrastructural development of St. John's, but what will follow afterwards. And so we are anticipating great outcomes from these type of activities. I'd want to leave it there. There are lots more stories to tell, but I guess we will have to have other fora where we will engage the public on some of the economic activity and the economic developments that are to come. But I just wanted to leave it there, and I'm sure that the media, as is your want, would have several questions in relation to what I just presented or other areas that you may wish to explore.
Our thanks to Minister Nicholas and our thanks to Ambassador Hurst. There are my colleagues on Skype as well who will be asking questions in a short while. There are Zoe Carlton from ZDK. There is also Nathan Owens from Caribbean Radio Lighthouse and Orville Williams from Observer Media Group. In a short while, we'll come to you, colleagues, on Skype. Just a few quick questions from you, Minister. In relation to the mandatory vaccination policy for 12-year-olds and over for schools, of course, there had been pretty minimal take-up, as you mentioned, in terms of the opportunity that was presented for students to get the vaccination on school plans. For those students who are not vaccinated and without an exemption certificate, that is, what is the plan of action? Is it that they will be learning remotely during the period until they're vaccinated?
That will be the option for them, yes.
Okay, and all is in place for that in terms of ensuring that they're learning remotely until?
I suspect that the Ministry of Education and the education officials may have to do some fine-tuning in terms of how they allocate resources to be able to deal with that. But do recall that at the start of these engagements, the Ministry of Education had presented several different scenarios in which they would have either all remote learning or the hybrid which they are now utilizing, which is some face-to-face with a schedule of attendance at schools at some days and some days off. So I think it is within the context of the stage 2, the level 2 that they're doing, that they should be able to accommodate those students in a non-face-to-face environment.
Okay, all right. And
let me just add here, Garfield, that the Ministry of Education and the Director of Education was pretty forceful that they wanted to uphold their mandate to provide education to all as a point of law, and we did accept that, but also did indicate that there was also the compelling case for public health. We also want to ensure that all our students, at all grades, at all levels, both public and private, have the best opportunity for success, and we think that the best environment for them is to be before the teachers in a face-to-face environment. And what we want to ensure is that as we get closer and closer to community immunity, then we obviously will have face-to-face education for all, back to the way it was, even without reference to thinning out the classrooms. So the more students that get vaccinated, and we have already made the case about the teachers, and we are satisfied that we have a full cadre of teachers who are vaccinated. What we want the students to do is to take responsibility for their future, along with their parents, and to get them vaccinated so that we could get them back into the optimal environment where they have face-to-face contact with their teachers. We have looked at what is taking place, the development that is taking place with respect to vaccinations for below 12, up to 5 years old, from 5 to 12. And we're watching it keenly because as soon as those vaccines become available as well, we will certainly seek to use all of our facilities to avail ourselves of those vaccines so that we can provide protection for those younger ones as well. Bearing in mind that, as I'd indicated approximately 5 weeks ago, when we started with the mandates in the public sector, that our strategy has changed from one where we are hoping to achieve zero COVID infections to one where we are going to live with COVID. And the way we see to live with COVID is to have the maximum amount of persons having a layer of protection that should they get COVID, come in contact with the virus, that they will at least have a safe passage through the whole process. And that's what we want to achieve, and that is the hallmark of our approach to living with COVID. So we just wanted to emphasize that. We certainly want to get, in the foreseeable future, all students and teachers back into the classrooms in the schools. But we cannot do that while so many persons who are eligible to be vaccinated remain unvaccinated.
Right, and I was actually just about to ask you as well, Minister, about the 5 to 11-year-olds in terms of the reduced dosage from Pfizer that's available for them. So thanks for raising that as well. In terms of the timeline for reopening, fully reopening the economy, Minister, the government has been saying, and you yourself have been saying at recent post-cabinet media briefings, that it's would have been pretty much about 90 days, taking us around about to the end of the year. Is that still a timeline, taking into account the fact that there has been a slowing of the pace of vaccination in recent weeks?
That is still our expectation, and that is still our ambition. And that is the reason why we are placing greater emphasis on the private sector to move towards implementing the mandate in the private sector. One matter that I omitted reporting on this morning, and I will do so now, the Attorney General in the proceedings of Cabinet yesterday did indicate that he had word from the court that a case that was brought against the government by the Antigua-Barbuda Workers Union had been thrown out of the court, and that case had to do with the public mandates, the mandates in the public sector, where a number of persons would have brought a case against the government, and they would have lost that case, it would have been thrown out. So our ambition is fortified even further by the fact that our position has been validated. And so you will expect to see greater and greater measures put in place to ensure that we can get closer and closer to that optimal number. We did discuss yesterday if it means that we will tighten the screws in terms of the mandates, and we may even go as far as to require for certain social engagements, like wedding receptions, that we may at a future point in time require that those mandates apply to those circumstances as well. We are not there yet, but if it means that we're going to have to get on to that level of minutiae to be able to obtain these numbers, that's what we are prepared to do.
Okay. Minister, in terms of the enhanced surveillance from the CBH, the government has promised that the CBH would have been equipped with a greater phalanx, to use the ambassador's words, of inspectors who are going out to do spot checks in some of these establishments to ensure that they're complying with the regulations. Has that been happening? And if so, has there been any sort of punitive action taken against people who are non-compliant? And in relation to the private sector, just a follow-up on this one, in relation to the private sector, the $5,000 fine would be for the operator, for the employer. Would there also be a fine for the individual who is working without being fully vaccinated, as required by the mandate?
No, that would fall to the employer. We are going to hold employers accountable. And so if they permit an employee who is not vaccinated to continue to work, then the lot falls upon them. Now, to the earlier point about the CBH, yes, we would have made an additional 6 persons from the jobs program available to CBH for them to train up and to arm themselves with a greater phalanx, as you would put it, to go out and do the inspection. But I have to indicate that we were made aware at an earlier point in time that there was some issues in relation to the Central Board of Health. When the public mandate was introduced, a number of the trained inspectors found themselves in a bit of a, how should I put it? They had not been vaccinated, and so they had to be separated from the workforce. I'm not aware, even at this stage, how that situation would have changed, whether or not there has been any resolution to those types of challenges. So there are some headcount issues that are affecting CBH workers. The Central Board of Health, certainly from the inspectorate, and the Minister of Health has not yet made his way back from the COP26 meetings in Scotland. And so I guess as he returns, he has to now focus on that particular area. But we are expecting the CBH to play their useful role in terms of this common requirement for inspections and for ensuring that the mandates have its full effect.
Okay, just a final quick question from the Minister before I go over to my colleagues on Skype. In relation to, so bars and clubs reopen as of next Monday. Fetes, though, are not allowed yet. Is the government concerned that there could be a way to, in a way, circumvent that, because some of the bars have significant capacity to hold people, or is there going to still be a limit on the number of people who can actually be in the bar at any one point? Let's say, for example, there's a huge, well, a big enough bar that can hold a number of people properly socially distanced. Would that not be a kind of way to almost have a Fete? And why is the government considering not having Fetes reopen at this point, though?
Well, I think that having a Fete, you know, it's a lot less easy to control. We did attempt early on in the summer to have some control environments where Fetes could have been staged, and we went through extensive measures in working with some of the promoters to be able to do that. We would have done at least, I think, 2 or 3 of them. And yes, but immediately after that, we had a huge uptick in the COVID infections. And so we would have had to go back to a format of a reduced events, reducing those events. So we think it wise now to get the absolute numbers up. We would go back to that as well. But as we indicated, if we get as close as possible to 80,000, then it means that we're dealing with a much smaller band of persons who are unvaccinated. They will still, if they do become infected with COVID, still have the opportunity to multiply the number of persons in the community that is infected, including persons that have been vaccinated. But of course, the impacts on the health sector would be less. And of course, the way we are treating with this matter is that we want to lead from the position where we know we have the optimal opportunity to protect ourselves. And then, of course, the whole intent is to open up the entire economy and to open up all activities, including FETs, to that type of reality. But we need the numbers to get up to 80,000 to make that a realistic undertaking.
Okay. And just to follow up, Minister, there is a limit on the number who can be in the bars at any one point, correct?
Based on the previously prescribed numbers that have been agreed with the Central Board of Health, yes.
Okay. Thanks, Minister. Really appreciate it. Let's go over now to my colleagues on Skype. Let's go over first to Zoe Carlton from ZDK. Good morning, Zoe. Your questions, please.
Good morning, gentlemen. Happy Armistice Day.
Good morning, Zoe. Yeah, happy Armistice Day to you too.
Thank you. I'd like to get the COVID questions over and done with, if you don't mind, sir. A couple of concerns from a number of businesses. Some Rastafari are presenting exemption letters, but they have not been signed by the government. So who should be certifying the exemption letters to make them valid, please?
A number of businesses have been... could you repeat the part of the question?
A number of businesses are concerned. They have been receiving exemption cards from the Rastafari community particularly, but they have not been signed by anybody in the government. Could you tell them who should be certifying exemption letters that are presented to businesses, please?
Well, yes, this is a matter that we would have discussed. The body that was established under the Public Health Advisory to deal with the whole question of exemptions was put in place to facilitate the exemptions in the public sector. And so it does not adequately cover the private sector. I think the whole question of the way we have done it in the public sector is that representations are made and there has to be background checks. And there are a number of persons who, and we are aware, and I'm obliged to indicate that we are aware that some persons who have never practiced the faith of the Rastafari have now sought to use this as an avenue to escape. And so it is not just the whole question of an application for an exemption from a Rastafari. There has to be background checks. And there is some judgment in relation to whether or not the persons who are doing the review are satisfied that these persons are, in fact, genuinely of that faith. And if there is any reason to indicate, and we would want to caution individuals to know that, you know, your colleagues, both persons who you live with and persons who you work with, would be checked to verify your claims that you're a Rastafari. And if that is the case, then you would not be granted the exemption. But to answer the question in terms of the private sector, I think the private sector have got to put in place a similar regime to be able to make a determination as to whether or not they would want to grant exemptions to such persons.
But the question really, sir, is for the businesses who are presented with an exemption form from somebody trying to enter the premises, just a stamp that says I'm Rastafarian is clearly not acceptable. What are they looking for to let people into their premises?
Well, again, you're asking me where is the authority for them to be able to accept it, and they're looking for a government stamp of approval.
It must be a government stamp of approval.
I guess I'm going to have to take that one offline and come back in response to that. But if a business had an application for an exemption on religious grounds from someone, and it is not approved by the Ecclesiastical Commission or any agency of the government, and they're not prepared to accept it, then I guess that is a matter that we'll have to look at in terms of how do we treat with that, and to give both the businesses and the individual who wants to get that exemption, how to give them a clear passage through this particular maze. I'm going to have to refer it back to for consideration internally.
Thank you, sir. It's really what the businesses want to do if somebody wants to come into the bar and they have an exemption form that's not stamped properly by the government. That really is the question. They need to know.
Well, I think the exemption, Zoe, in any case, whether or not we get them through this maze today or tomorrow, the exemption should be for the employees. But for patrons, or what they need, it's a vaccination card. I don't know that we have considered exemptions for persons who would want to attend bars. So let's be clear on that.
Thank you.
The exemptions are for employees, not for patrons.
Thank you, sir. That is what I think the businesses need to know. And another quick question from the businesses. I know you touched on the vaccination cards, but some of the businesses are still a little bit concerned about the length of time. Could you just reassure them that they just need to hold on and be patient, and the cards will be forthcoming for their staff?
Right. Let me again emphasize that the Get Vax card at ab.gov.ag is the shortest route to getting the applications done. The days are cleared, the cards are cleared on a first-come basis. There are a number of persons who have facilitated on one email multiple card applications. And I think from my review of that, there have been a number of times where persons have said, I've submitted my application and I can't get my card back. And invariably, whenever we check that the cards have been produced and that they're under the name of the person who made the original application. So let me give an example. So Melford Nicholas applies for the card on behalf of his sisters. And they carry a different last name because they're married. And so when they now make an individual application under their married name, the system has no way of saying, listen, we do not have a card, we do not have an application for you as Richards or as James or as Housen. So clearly, what needs to happen is that they need to say, I made an application on the Melford Nicholas, and in which case we can do the proper search. And those are some of the instances that have caused delays. But I'm happy to indicate that we are able to do upwards of 1,000 cards. I think I've seen one evening where we would have done over 1,100 cards. And we are able to produce the cards based on that type of daily demand. And persons should use the Get Vax card at ab.gov.ag with the necessary instruments that they need to facilitate that process. And what we're going to have to do is to give them, to give the public an email or number that they can submit their queries to if there are still any unscheduled or unusual delays. But I'm satisfied that we're up to enough capacity to be able to facilitate all of the cards.
Thank you, sir. My next question is based around tourism. We have a lot of tourists coming in, a lot of them down in English Harbour, and there's a lot of concern down here that as the tourists come in, so are the drug dealers. And we have some drug dealers, the drug dealers.
Yes.
And we have some drug dealers who are blatant, but nothing is happening to stop them. And they are intimidating the tourists. And there's no mistake of what they are doing. Is there anything in plan by the police to actually start clamping down on these people? They are causing problems and intimidating tourists.
I would want to believe that in the circumstances that you just described, that the governing authorities in that particular area, to include the national parks and all of the people who are involved in the tourism trade, would have made the necessary representation to Mr. Rodney and his team for increased surveillance and interventions in that particular area. This is not a matter that was before the cabinet. I can indicate, though, that even yesterday, both the Attorney General and myself, and based on his representation, have asked for increased electronic surveillance in a number of areas, which we are seeking now to implement starting in the next coming days in terms of enhancing the CCTV network. I'm aware that there had been a network of surveillance cameras in the dockyard area, and that those would have long passed their best date. And so the intention is to continue to improve the surveillance capabilities. But insofar as the presence of the police and persons who are monitoring and surveilling those areas where that type of activity will take place. That's going to be a call on the Royal Police Force of Antigua and Barbuda.
Thank you, sir. It is a deep concern down here at the moment as well. There is no sign, I'm afraid, of the police doing anything about it. I will raise the question with them. Thank you for that. And I know on crime, and I know you cannot mention specific cases, but we have seen 12 murders, possibly more this year in Antigua and Barbuda. How many arrests have actually been made on these murders?
I do not have any of that information. I do know that the Attorney General earlier this week had a meeting with the senior officials from the police force, and that was one of the areas that they had been looking at in terms of ensuring that they keep a lid on the escalation of serious crime, to include armed robberies and that type of stuff. Insofar as killings are concerned, I'm afraid that much cannot be done in terms of prevention. We certainly want to get guns off of the street and out of the hands of would-be criminals. We have certainly utilized the route of having amnesty, gun amnesties, and I believe since we have been in office over the past 7+ years, we would have had at least 3 gun amnesties, and of course the results have been moderate, to say the least. And so there is, I think recently, the Crime Stoppers had published a platform to allow persons to inform law enforcement officials where they can help to suppress crime. And I guess the responsibility of the entire society to keep criminal activity down really calls for persons to be able to do something about that. But whereas you started out the question about 12 murders, to the extent that these may be motivated as either A, crime of passion, or B, having to deal with some kind of gang activity, there's very little that the law enforcement can do in terms of prevention. What they can move to is detection and then, of course, prosecution. But to that extent, that type of crime exists in open societies like ours, it is to ensure that majority of persons are involved in wholesome, positive activity and not necessarily having to rely on crime as a way of living.
Thank you, sir. I have one more question, if I may, about COP26. The Prime Minister has said that he felt it wasn't a success. My question is, why does he think that? And does this influence our nationally determined contributions to which we've committed? Those are the questions, please, sir.
Well, I think it depends on where the bar had been set. Do you recall the Prime Minister's chairman of OASIS and all of the preparatory meetings that were done? The one issue that the Prime Minister clearly wanted to place on the agenda for the global discussion was the whole question of loss and damage. And to the extent that he was able to insert that into the conversation, and to the further extent that both the nation state of Tuvalu and Antigua and Barbuda have joined forces to establish a commission looking at the whole question of taking this matter down the legal level, the legal chain. The notes would indicate to you the equation that we have been left with after the disastrous Category 5+++ storm that we had in Barbuda in 2017, that we are still left with holding the basket for $200+ million worth of restitution for Barbuda. And of course, the impact clearly has to do with the climate change effects that we're receiving from global warming. So the question is, in terms of the success that the Prime Minister is alluding to, is the fact that we have been able to establish that position and to put that demarcation line in terms of what we will be arbitering for in these conversations. In terms of what other countries do in terms of reducing their carbon footprint and carbon emissions, that is something that's a goal that has to be pursued collaboratively by all countries. And so I don't know that much more could have been expected from Antigua's and indeed the Prime Minister's participation in these events. But I think that is where he's actually indicating that it was successfully done, and the rest will be what we manage in the months and years going forward.
Thank you, Zoe. Appreciate it. Thanks. Really appreciate it. Let's go now over to Orville Williams. Orville is with Observer Media Group. Good morning, Orville. Your questions, please.
Good morning. Thank you, Garfield. Morning, Minister, and good morning, Ambassador Hurst.
Good morning, Orville.
My first question this morning is also on the requirement for all students to now be vaccinated for COVID-19. In this case, is the onus on the parents still to ensure that the children who they refuse to get vaccinated and have to stay home for remote learning to engage in this process? So do they still have the responsibility to pick up the work from the schools or to get the child signed into some kind of technology to take their lessons? And I ask this because the logistical challenge that this new requirement might have on these parents who still have their children unvaccinated, but they were being allowed to go to school. In response to that renewed challenge, they might, refuse to participate in the remote learning experience. But at the same time, it is a legal requirement for kids at the learning age to go to school. So is the onus on the parent to ensure that they engage in the remote learning, or will it be a case where the schools now will have some kind of authoritative approach to ensure that the parents participate?
Well, there is a legal requirement placed on parents by the Education Act that their children should be educated at least up until the age of 16. So the Education Act mandates that. And so, yes, there is a legal obligation that parents have to make their children be put forward to be educated. But this is a recent lived experience. Before we reopened up the schools, the hue and cry was that parents needed to get a relief because they're having to go to work and having to deal with minor children and having to deal with children being at home. It's more costly. The teachers were complaining that, the best environment for students would have been before the teachers, and we would have gone through this whole exercise. The break in transmission came when because of the delay in the supply of the additional set of Pfizer vaccines, we were faced with a situation that we could not provide Pfizer vaccines based on the demand. And our assessment was based on our engagement with the public school system and the Ministry of Education officials, and that there were approximately 8,000 eligible students in the public sector, in the school sector that could be vaccinated. At the time when we were faced with the shortage, the supply disruption, approximately 5,000 students would have already taken at least the first dose of vaccines. It meant, therefore, that there were approximately 3,000 students who had to come forward to be vaccinated. We gave, based on some extreme pressure, I would say, from the Ministry of Education, consideration that while we were waiting the arrival of the other vaccines, to take on an additional risk of having those additional 3,000 students go back to school in the face-to-face learning environment. But we do not want them to take the intention of the government for granted. During that period of time as well, we would have gone to Parliament, and in addition to the public health and the state of emergency obligations that came with those two requirements, to put in place the mandate for students, we made it law that all eligible students would be required to take the vaccine. So it's a matter of law. So there are two pieces of law: the compunction and the requirement to educate our students, of which the parents are also obligated to ensure that that happens. And we must make facilities available to them to do that, both in terms of the school plant and the teaching facilities. But as well, there is also the obligation for the parents to do what is lawful to be able to ensure the health of the children and the health of the environment in which they operate in. And that is where we are. So they have just reverted back to the prior conditions before the schools were opened. And we're satisfied that good sense will prevail and that they will do what is necessary within the coming days to ensure that they're doing the best for their children, as we are trying to do for them as well.
All right, thank you very much, Minister. My second question is on the move from the PCR test for incoming passengers to Antigua and Barbuda. Can you, one, say what was the reason behind taking this decision, and confirm whether it is essentially confidence in the level of vaccination so far that has, promoted that?
It's confidence in a number of levels. It's confidence in terms of, yes, we are satisfied that a greater percentage of our people here, particularly those in the front line, have been vaccinated. One, we are also satisfied that there is a greater reliance that can be placed on these rapid tests. It's not every rapid test, but as you would note from the notes, there are a panel of rapid tests that both the WHO, the CDC in the United States, and of course the NHS in the UK have relied upon. And so we are going to publish those particular tests that fall into those three brackets, and we would accept those. It also is a function of cost and availability as well in some of our source markets to ensure that we can boost our tourism product as well here. So it's confidence in a number of levels, and we are satisfied, even where a person would show up in the jurisdiction, that they may have come through without an acceptable test, that at the point of entry they will be required to have a PCR test being done. So I think we have looked at all the possibilities, and the Chief Medical Officer did give us the particular responses to the particular issue before giving her consent that we should move along this route.
Orville, just before your remaining questions, could you turn on your camera, please? Is that possible for you? It'd be great to...
No, my internet is not stable at this point.
Okay,
So
that's fine.
why I have it off.
Okay, please proceed.
Usually have it on.
Okay.
But yeah, Minister, the Pfizer vaccine for 5 to 11, you have repeatedly voiced the administration's confidence and anticipation of having that regime here in Antigua and Barbuda. I was reading a report from Pfizer that was detailing some of the things that the Pfizer vaccine for this age group would need versus the one for adults. It includes a different kind of dosage, a different dilution strategy, and different storage options. My question is, do you know, or can you say whether the health ministry is keeping abreast with these, minute details, which, are largely important? And
absolutely.
And can you say whether the capacity for those are already on island, or it would require maybe some additional purchases?
I would say yes, yes, and yes. The government has been responsible at all levels with this particular matter. We have put in place at the initial stage when we had COVAX, the application for vaccines through COVAX. We had put in place, in addition to having our pharmacy council, we had put in place a technical advisory group, which we have maintained even outside of the requirements of COVAX. And we rely on the expertise and the professionals that are in that technical advisory group to inform the process of the government. The Ministry of Health would have availed itself of all of the underlying prerequisites to be able to have vaccinations being received, stored, and deployed. You would recall that when we were going to deploy the Pfizer vaccines, there was a different protocol for the application of the Pfizer vaccine. So we had them on board here, and it took us perhaps maybe a week or two until the nurses were adequately trained and the other public health officials were adequately trained to apply these particular vaccines. So the answer to your question is yes. Whatever technical and facility requirements there are, the government will absolutely put those in place before we take on board the challenge of deploying these vaccines in that environment, particularly to our tender little ones. So yes, the government will remain responsible, as it has been throughout the course of the vaccine process.
Thank you, Minister. Regarding the AstraZeneca vaccine, I think, if I'm not mistaken, that's the vaccine that you have the most capacity for on island at this moment. But you had acknowledged some time ago that when we got some doses of the Pfizer vaccine, that had largely become the vaccine of choice for people who got vaccinated during that time when it was available. Now you're expecting another 19,000 doses of AstraZeneca with the hope that this will push us towards that herd immunity limit. Outside of the boosters that might come into play or will come into play, which will use up some of that, is the government concerned about maybe wastage or anything like that, seeing that the uptake of the AstraZeneca to this point has remained slow?
No, not really. Again, as I've indicated, and as we have demonstrated a few times already, there has been a functional level of collaboration that have taken place at least to the best of my knowledge, between member states of CARICOM. Where there is any surplus capacity in one particular jurisdiction, we have supported each other. I know in the case of St. Kitts Nevis and in the case of the Bahamas and in Trinidad, we would have assisted them with some surplus capacity that we have had, and vice versa. St. Lucia has responded and assisted us, so too has St. Vincent. And Dominica, in the initial phase, had been the first to give us a gift of 5,000 vaccines. So anyway that there is surplus capacity and there is a need in one of our Caribbean member states, any of our Commonwealth member states, or anyone within our political environment that would have a need for these vaccines, and we cannot use them at the particular point in time, I'm certain and satisfied that we will make those available to them. But we want to ensure that in all circumstances we have all of the options available for our population, and persons freely choose which is a vaccine of their choice based on what is available. And so we will continue to make AstraZeneca available to the population.
All right, thank you, Minister. Just one short question from one of my colleagues. They want to know if there's an update on the dismantling of the double-decker stand. That's my final question.
Yes, that continues to be an ongoing objective of the Ministry of Sports. One of the preliminary steps that they had to take was to provide some continuity for those persons who were running small businesses, food shops, small restaurants in the compounds of the Antigua Recreation Grounds. Those facilities were built up adjacent to the government printery, and I suspect that once the vendors have been transferred, then of course the demolition will take place shortly after that. But it's still a project that is active, but that is a prerequisite and preliminary step that has to be taken.
All right, thank you very much, Minister. Back to you, Garfield.
Thanks, Orville. Really appreciate it. And let's go finally now to Nathan Owens. Nathan is with Caribbean Radio Lighthouse. Good morning, Nathan. Your questions, please.
Good morning, gentlemen. Good morning, Minister.
Good morning, Nathan.
In light of the significant drop in active COVID cases, has there been any consideration given to relaxing the mask wearing mandate in workplaces, specifically where the workplace employees are 100% vaccinated and where the workplace does not interact with customers or the public on a regular basis?
Not likely. We anticipate that we are more than likely going to see a vaporization of many of the controls, particularly those that restrict movements in the new year when the state of emergency expires. But the one mandate that will continue for the foreseeable future is the wearing a mask and the other sanitation requirements. Even the public health officials have indicated that more than ever this year, there's been a reduction in the number of airborne flus, and that is directly attributable to the fact that people are wearing masks. And so the whole idea of transmission of viruses, whether it be COVID or any other type of virus that can be airborne, has been minimized. So it's still a good practice, it's still a healthy practice, and it's still our best defense against mass transmission of COVID. In as much as we're fortifying our systems, our resistant systems, we want to ensure that prevention is the best form of cure. And so to the best extent that we can prevent the virus from spreading, and as Dr. Joseph had said, sometimes it's the people that move the virus around. And so if we can keep it contained by the continuous wearing of masks, then I suspect that in the foreseeable future, mask wearing is going to be an ongoing requirement for us to protect ourselves against COVID.
Thank you. Just a follow-up or to further develop what Zoe was asking about in relation to the vaccination cards, that's great news that the capacity has increased. For individuals who have submitted months ago for the application or for their vaccination card and have not heard anything, have sent emails, not received any reply, I know in my case I've called and have been told that the people answering the phone do not interact with the people that have the emails, and so what's the way forward? How do you follow through? I know I've spoken with others who are in a similar instance.
Sure. And as I've indicated earlier, I will undertake to provide a separate email and a phone that I can that will ensure that the queries will be adequately attended to by the people who can and make the turnaround. It's a simple process. I'm satisfied that in every instance that has been drawn to my attention and persons have utilized all possible means of contacting me, even through my social media platforms, where I have made an intervention, it invariably comes down to the fact that the request came into the ministry from a third party and on an email account. And so the person making the inquiry was not the original person, and so that created a little mismatch in terms of the search criteria. But if they can indicate in those instances who made the application and from what email address, it's an easy trace. So it's something that I'll fix in the coming days. And I'm certain by Monday, when the anticipated deluge starts, or even tomorrow, we will be in a position to have that check and fix. And of course, I'll utilize state media. We will update the public advisory that's there for the vaccines to include the number that you and the email address that you would have to use if you have a delay in receiving your card.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
In relation to the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, the CDC website states that people who receive the Johnson & Johnson vaccine and are 18 years old or older should receive a booster shot at least 2 months after receiving the primary vaccine. Is Antigua and Barbuda following that recommendation, and as such, are those who have received the Johnson & Johnson encouraged to come in and return to receive that booster?
I've not seen anything yet from our public health officials with an advocacy for persons to come in for a booster shot for Johnson & Johnson. What I can say, though, is that based on where the cabinet was yesterday, and you would see from the notes that we are now asking the technical advisory group to give full consideration to what we must now do to facilitate booster shots. Of course, that's going to have an impact on the further stock and availability of vaccines to be able to accommodate, a second round in the case of Johnson & Johnson, and in the case of AstraZeneca and Pfizer, if they're going to be booster shots, how much of available vaccines we need to have to be able to facilitate second doses where they're still pending, and of course meet the third dose for a booster shot. But it's certainly something that we're now looking at, as again, it falls in line with our requirement to fortify ourselves to, live side by side and adjacent to COVID.
Thank you. One final question. Can you clarify those who have a vaccination exemption as an employee and are still required to be tested every other week? Are they required to take the PCR test or a rapid test?
My memories are a bit cloudy on that particular one because we've been so focused on ensuring that the mandate. But that should be a quick check. Excuse me, sorry. It should be a quick check. But to the extent that I do not recall, the rapid tests have been the ones that we have utilized for those instances for testing. We would recall that when the requirement for ongoing testing came in, that there was a whole question as it went out in the media, and persons were speculating that for a PCR test at $300, it would have been unaffordable for persons. And we had actually reduced the cost down for the rapid test to approximately $50 in those instances. And insofar as the requirement for public servants, we would have provided those tests for public servants where they're required to provide bi-weekly testing that we granted to them for free. In the case of persons in the private sector, they should be able to avail themselves of prescribed rapid tests to be able to satisfy that requirement. So I'm now indicating that as I started speaking, and it became back clear to me that yes, the rapid test is adequate for those purposes.
Thank you very much for that information. Have a safe rest of the week.
Thank you, and same to you.
Thank you so much, Nathan. Really appreciate it. Minister, just a quick follow-up on the question of rapid tests. One of the notes indicate point 3 of number 1, that a travel advisory is to be issued shortly that would give permission to passengers arriving in Antigua and Barbuda to take an approved rapid test effective November 17 and to be fully vaccinated in order to gain entry. And there's a list of the approved tests that will be included in the travel advisory. So the change would then be that they would no longer be needing to come in with a negative PCR test. Is that it?
Either or. So a PCR test, again, as I've indicated, there are a number of persons who would wish to avail themselves of a vacation in Antigua, coming from some of these areas. And sometimes, based on the 4-day requirement for PCR tests, the 4-day window, it may present them with particular challenges. And so, again, our levels of confidence in utilizing these tests has a lot to do with the number of persons who are vaccinated in some of those source markets as well. So the number of persons in those source markets who have already been vaccinated, and of course, based on the CDC, I believe the notes did say FDA, but it meant the CDC. We meant to say the CDC, the WHO, and the National Health Service in the UK have been utilizing over a period of time a panel of rapid tests that they have learned to rely on, and so we are going to lean on their experience and include those as the panel upon which we will find acceptable at our ports of entry for would-be tourists or returning residents and nationals coming back to Antigua.
Okay, so just to be clear, Minister, all passengers coming in, citizens, residents, and visitors would have to be fully vaccinated, and they can either come in with a negative PCR test or have a rapid test done as of the 17th.
That's correct.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much for that, Minister. Really appreciate it. It's back over to yourself and Ambassador Hurst to wrap things up this morning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Burford. You know that last Wednesday we did not hold cabinet, and therefore last Thursday morning there was no post-cabinet press briefing. So since independence was November the 1st, this would be the very first time that we are hosting this post-cabinet press briefing. Let me take the opportunity to recall that our 40th anniversary of independence went off without incident, and that in fact it was a real celebratory moment. Some people were nevertheless inconvenienced because of the COVID-19 and the impact it has had on revenues. One of those groups was the Social Security recipients, and you may note that $10 million have been dispatched to Social Security by the Ministry of Finance in order to bring the Social Security recipients up to date for the months of September and October. And we believe that there is sufficient to allow for payments on time in November. And we think that it's a clear indication that we're doing very well insofar as the payments to our Social Security recipients are concerned. Remember, the government is paying not $2 or $3 million a month as is required, but rather somewhere in the region of about $12 million a month in order to meet the significant shortfall in revenues to Social Security flowing from the absence of workers in the field. That's picking up as the hotels begin to experience fuller employment, and restaurants and other kinds of small businesses are on their way towards making the economy continue to function well. Having said that, you know that our minister has the last word. Minister Nicholas.
Yes, thank you, Ambassador Hurst, and I thank you for reinserting that, because we did disclose that in the notes, and I believe the pensioners would at least feel a sense of relief knowing that the promise that we made has now been kept, that the first draw, as it were, on the CDC funds actually went to the pensioners, and that is appropriate given that they would have put in the baseline work upon which all of us now have benefited from. So it is important and appropriate that the pensioners should achieve final restitution. And let me just point to that again. The last published, a more recent published actuarial report for the Social Security had indicated that up until approximately 2009, approximately 10,000 persons had lost their jobs when we had the economic meltdown of 2007, 2008. So we came into government meeting a broke Social Security regime. The government had put some measures in place. In fact, the Prime Minister continues to, and I'm going to borrow it from our former Prime Minister, the late Celeste Bird, Prime Minister Gaston Brown continues to adumbrate that we have been the only administration that has not borrowed money, caused any restriction in the revenues for the Social Security. In fact, we have made our obligations to Social Security on a monthly basis ever since we came into government. However, that still remains insufficient given that there was a cavernous hole that was created by the loss of those 10,000 workers between 2008 and when we came into office. Notwithstanding, we had put regimes in place to increase the contribution for Social Security, and we had put two measures in place. One, to increase the level of contributions that were coming from employees and employers, and we tried to get that rate up to 13%. We also put in a deferral in terms of the number of persons who could draw a pension from Social Security by gradually changing the pension age. And of course, while that was in place, that persons were entering the pensionable era a bit later, and ultimately we're trying to get that pensionable age up to 65. COVID intervened, and we saw a further loss of approximately 10,000 persons in the hotel and tourism sector. So all of these measures had a knock-on effect on Social Security. Notwithstanding, I am aware and I can reiterate that every month from the CIP, that much maligned stream of revenue for the government, that the opposition continues to indicate that we have abused. Nothing could be further from the truth. We have given line by line account of what we have done with those funds. Every month, we contribute at minimum $3 million from that fund to the Social Security. At minimum, I've said. There are months when it is more. In fact, I believe in the Prime Minister's more recent presentation, it would have indicated that we would have been up to in excess of $30 million in excess of what our obligations were. But that is to ensure that persons who are drawing a pension from Social Security, their requirements could have been met. And so again, the $10 million that we have made available to the Social Security is in anticipation of it being able to catch itself when the economy returns. And hopefully the need for us to continue to meet these shortfalls and to bolster it in the manner that we have over the past 2+ years will recede, and that the Social Security can go with the two measures that we have put in place, increasing the contributions up to 13% collectively from both businesses and employees alike, plus the fact that we are pushing the retirement age back to 65, will over a period of time help the Social Security to regain its health and its strength, and it will be able to stand up on its own. But we're just happy and delighted today that, excuse me, we're going to be able to meet our pensioners' obligations up to and including the end of October, which will bring us up to current, and hopefully in the months ahead, we will continue to maintain that requirement. So it's a good position for the government and for the pensioners and for all to be a part of. I'll just say one final word on the CIP. Just yesterday, the Prime Minister would have indicated to the Attorney General that at the next sitting of Parliament, he would expect us to give a full account of the CIU funds. And again, it is in keeping with our mandate to always be accountable to the public for the resources that we take on board on their behalf and how we expend it. And it is a record that we are very proud of and we can defend at all times. Thank you very much for being with us this morning, and I look forward to our ongoing engagements in the weeks ahead.
Our thanks to Minister Nicholas, and our thanks to Ambassador Hurst, and our thanks to my colleagues on Skype, Zoe Carlton from ZDK, Nathan Owens from Caribbean Radio Lighthouse, and Orville Williams from Observer Media Group. Apologies that Orville wasn't able to be seen this morning, but just had some internet challenges, but we heard his questions loud and clear. We appreciate all our colleagues for having participated in these proceedings today on this Armistice Day. Of course, on the 11th hour of the 11th day, of the 11th month in 1918, the end of World War I, 1914 to 1918, signed between the Allies and Germany in Compiègne in France. Of course, we'll have much more on Remembrance Sunday coming up. Of course, full coverage on ABS. We appreciate your company. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll unpack details of these proceedings in subsequent newscasts. Until then, good morning. You are in tune with the nation's stations, ABS TV Channel 10, the GIS, and ABS Radio 90.5 FM. Proudly serving you, reaching more and more people every day.